Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of The Terror Zone. Today will be an interesting episode because we'll be talking about Peter Pan, one of the most darker stories of the Disney catalog. And there have been many different versions of Peter Pan for sure. And a lot of them have developed the character in many different ways. And you may be surprised on how dark this kid truly is. Just like Pinocchio, he has a more darker side to him than the normal character we see before. So we'll take a deeper look at the Peter Pan. Not only will we be looking at his real original story of the book, but we'll be looking into his backstory a little bit and how he differentiates from today. So we'll be seeing a lot of changes for Peter a lot. Just like the Alice in Wonderland story, we're taking a little piece by piece, but there'll only be two versions of this particular story. We'll be looking into his backstory first, and then the actual story. So just kick back, relax, let me tell you the story about Peter Pan. First of all, let me just show you what Peter Pan is really about. Peter Pan's about a boy who never grows up. He lives in a magical world called Neverland, where he plays along with pirates and Indians, along with his friends like the Lost Boys and Tinkerbell. One day, Peter Pan comes across a house, the Darling House, and decides to take them along on this magical journey along with him as they play with him throughout the usually day-to-day play that he has. So that's pretty much the whole story from there. And then when he teaches the kids about having a mother, and then they decide to go home after shortly being captured by Captain Hook and having to save them. And that's the whole story from there. They teach them. Peter Pan teaches them how to fly, and have lots of fun together. Wendy, being the girl that she is, all girly girl and nice to Peter, she may have a little crush on her for all I know, and so does Tinkerbell. Then we have John, who is the smart one, has a bit of a top hat and nice. Then we have Michael, who is the baby of the family, with a little cute face and a teddy bear. All of these have different personalities. As the Lost Boys, all have different personalities as well. There's a twins, there is taller character, like slightly. There is the bear, that character that's very fat and chubby-like. All of them have different character personalities. That's really cool. So, we got them undercover. Let's move. Now we got all the characters and all in together. Let's talk about some other things. Like, for instance, Captain Hook. Captain Hook is the villain of the movie as well. After Peter Pan cut his hand off and gave it to the crocodile, he's been hunting for him ever since, along with his trusty sidekick, Mr. Smee. And so, and they also called Captain Hook a codfish. There's also a running gag within the movie as well. It's also a running gag is the crocodile trying to chase after Captain Hook. And this also works along well with the octopus being chasing in the second Neverland Peter Pan movie. Now let's move along. Now that we know about each character, let's move on to the flashback of Peter Pan. Now, I'm sure you know who. I'm sure Peter Pan never wants to grow up, but he never understood why he wanted to grow up. Well, this is what the story tells. It goes very back to when Peter was just a baby, actually. So we're gonna take this part of the story took inspiration from G.M. Barrie's first story about Peter Pan. It's not really about Peter Pan at all, but it's inspiration for what could happen next. So the story is about a little baby who was raised by fairies and just flies around. This is what happens later. Later comes to be Peter Pan. Now let's talk about Peter Pan's backstory. It all starts a very long time ago. Instead of storks, in this version, Peter actually grows wings. And as a baby, he flies all around, just like all the rest of the babies. What they're supposed to do is that they're supposed to fly around until they get to their parents. But Peter, instead of going around and going to his parents, he decides to fly around and actually have fun with his wings. Kind of like Icarus with his wings. He just flies around and is so amazed by it that he just flies around, forgets all about his parents. And for a long while, as a baby, he actually does this. A lot. In fact, he goes up to an age where he gets older. He's afraid of, well, losing his wings. You see, once the baby actually goes to the parents, the wings fall off. So when Peter is flying around, he's worried that if he goes back to his parents, his wings will fall off and he'll never be able to fly anymore, or to fly around like he wants to right now. So, as he's flying around, he decides to fly around forever. And this goes on for a very long time. Like, for a very long time. Until he starts to miss his parents. He wants to see his mother, so he goes off to see his mother in the window. But unfortunately, Peter sees that his mother has another baby instead of him. Peter Pan gets jealous of the new baby arriving. He thinks that this new baby well, replaced him. He thinks that this baby loves him more than his mother ever could. His mother never wanted him, so instead she replaced him with somebody else. Which is kind of sad when you think about it. So poor Peter decides that he just goes flying around until he meets a bunch of fairies, like Tinkerbell for instance, and takes him to Neverland, where he could never grow up. And that's where we are today with his backstory. And so let's start with the story and how it differentiates from the actual book. Now the book starts out very roughly similar to the movie, only in greater detail. So we'll have to take it step by step, telling every detail about each one. Okay, so let's talk about Peter Pan. The story is very similar, pretty much, to the Disney version, surprisingly enough, only with a bit more detail about him. So we're going to look into more of it. As I go along, you could see some of the story unfold. So I will pick up on the parts that are different. So I won't be talking about the whole story. I'll just be talking about different details that happen in each of the parts of the story. So let's start at the beginning. The book kind of actually starts with Wendy and his brothers being told how their childhood happened and how she knows that it won't last forever. And it starts with the mother actually talking stories about Peter Pan as they listen. Unlike in the movie where Wendy actually talks about the stories instead of her. But in this one, their mother does. And Peter Pan eavesdropping to hear them every time. So very similar. Except for, well, you know. I would assume that in this version, they just have the mother telling them first, and then Wendy continues the generation by telling other stories that she makes up too as well. And then one night, Nana stole Peter Pan's shadow. And unlike the Disney version, Nana is not outside and chained up. She's actually in the house with them. So she never got in trouble for anything. And once Peter Pan walks in to get his shadow back, he barks at him right away and wakes everybody up, especially Wendy. Shortly after this, everything happens pretty much the same as the movie. Until they start to fly. And of course, it all starts very similar with Happy Thoughts and Pixie Dust. They were able to fly naturally. But as they were flying, it took a long way to get to Neverland than they thought. They actually encountered a lot of obstacles along the way, like birds, and the fact that Peter Pan kept forgetting who the Darling children were. So Wendy and his brothers went on a journey to go to Neverland with him. And Peter Pan kept forgetting who they were. So he kind of had what Dory had, short-term memory loss. I guess for one way to stay young, he had to forget some stuff. And as they get to Neverland, Wendy gets shot by one of the Lost Boys. Just like in the movie, but except Tinkerbell doesn't say anything to them. And I should also mention that every time that Peter Pan forgot about the Darling family, Wendy got very annoyed by this and had to keep introducing themselves to him. Just like in the movie, they shot Wendy just like they were told to by Tinkerbell. When Wendy gets injured, the Lost Boys quickly said sorry to her, and they made her a house called the Wendy House, which made her help her recover better, and that term is still used today, which is very interesting. And so the brothers, Wendy's two brothers, also developed their way of living with the Lost Boys as well, taking some of their life ways of doing things to heart, doing all their activities and stuff and what they do. But upon darling children living with Peter Pan for a while, they discovered a few things about the guy that doesn't seem right. Upon how Peter's showing them around the place, immediately Wendy becomes the mother of them right away. But they have picked up a few things about Peter that seem sketchy, like they found out about the Lost Boys and how they met Peter. They all met at a public park where they all wandered off and got lost and ended up finding Peter where they could just go to Neverland instead. It just sounds like to me that Peter Pan is a bit of a kidnapper, I guess. Or a child predator. He also, when the Lost Boys get too old, he kills them. Like, straight up kills them. Like, probably until they're 13. Okay. You're probably thinking right now that Neverland is a place where a kid can never grow up. Well, that's not exactly true. A kid can grow up. It's just Peter Pan stops that from happening. Like, for the moment the Lost Boy turns 13, Peter Pan, well, kills them. Wow. Yeah. That's probably how Captain Hook became older than he did, and he probably ran off. But who knows what his backstory is. But anyway, that's one thing that he does. Another thing that he does is that he tries to thin out the Lost Boys so they can fit through the oak tree through their hideout. Which is weird because, don't ask me how he does it, but maybe he tries to slow down their diet and make them smaller to fit in. Obviously, this is not in the Disney version because they have one fat Lost Boy in the group. So obviously they can fit in just fine, I guess. But in this version, I think as Peter Pan has the power to, like, make them skinnier? Yeah, that's not good for them, I don't think. I don't know. I don't want to know how he does it. So, yeah. And just like in Hook, they feed pretend food. Peter Pan feeds the Lost Boys and himself pretend food because he can't tell the difference between real food and fake food. So he just pretends to have food. Now, this is a very interesting idea for the Lost Boys to be doing, especially in Hook, and it's a really cool idea. And it's an imagination that runs wild. But the fact is that in the real story, it's really not there. And the kids could be starving for not eating real food. Sure, it's fun in Hook, and sure, it's real food when they believe it is. But when you consider the fact that they're not really eating true food, it's starting to be problemsome. Throughout the times that they've been living there, the darling children, they have been on countless adventures with Peter. Especially the most dangerous one of all, when they go meet the mermaids at Mermaid Lagoon. At Mermaid Lagoon, it plays out pretty much like the Disney movie. The mermaids don't like Wendy all too much, and they quickly try to drown her immediately when she gets there. But she also is accompanied by the Lost Boys as well, so they try to drown them as well. So surprisingly, the mermaids are not really nice to Peter or to any of them at all. So, pretty much. But they quickly get away because Peter sees a nearby ship where two pirates are kidnapping the chief's daughter. So Peter sees this and he impersonates himself as Captain Hook, just like the movie, and he agrees to let her go. So during this point, a battle ensues because Captain Hook finds him trying to save Tiger Lily after the drown. So battle ensues after that. But one interesting detail I want to talk about Captain Hook is that in the book, according to the story, Captain Hook actually has guards all around his ship. He doesn't let any other pirates roam around the area because he has spirit pirates, like ghost pirates, protect his ship, which is very interesting. I thought I'd like to mention that. Fortunately, after the battle, Peter Pan got very barely injured. And upon that, he got very weak and he couldn't really fly all too much. So he kind of was locked up there, and he found himself trapped on the same rock that Tiger Lily was there, supposedly drowned. So he couldn't really go anywhere at the moment. So Captain Hook just let them there to die. But luckily enough, a bird came over and made a nest for him to land on, so he can quickly sail back to the Lost Boys' nice back. So when Peter Pan came back to his hideout, he was actually awarded as a hero to the chiefs and the Indians all around, and the Lost Boys, and to everyone, especially Wendy, who starts to get very fond of Peter and starts to fall in love with him too at that. When Wendy asked about Peter Pan and loving him, Peter Pan remarks by saying that you're my mother and I'm your son. And loving that girl, and that is a whole different level. This is kind of creepy, to be honest, because to be honest, Peter Pan thinks of Wendy as his mother. And them being the same age, it's a little awkward. At first, it's almost like, well, you could take care of the Lost Boys, keep them in line when I'm not around, all that kind of stuff like a mother would do. But instead, it's like a little weird to me that Captain Peter Pan is considered to be a son to Wendy. You'd think like a dad or something, or like a leader to a troop, and he would be like her sidekick or whatever, but instead it's a little weird. It's more higher than a friend zone type of thing, so it's a little awkward to me. So when Wendy hears this, she's reminded of her parents, probably getting sick about her and the boys. So she decides that it's time for them to go home, along with her brothers. But she also decides to have upon hearing this, she decides to bring the Lost Boys to come along as well. All except for Peter, who decided to take a nap throughout this whole thing. Just like in the movie, pretty much, the same thing happens, except Peter Pan just takes a nap. And just like that, when they come out, the pirates kidnap them immediately, before they could go anywhere. Meanwhile, with Peter Pan, he was taking a brief nap, with Tinkerbell having to wake him up. During this scene, there was supposed to be a scene where Tinkerbell gets captured, like in the movie, where Captain Hook gives him a trap of some sorts, like a gift inside a bomb. And Tinkerbell goes to warn him about it, but doesn't listen, having Tinkerbell to take her life in the process. During this scene in particular, though, the play decides to let, and the book, I think, decides to do a little detail where Tinkerbell gets injured really bad from the trap, and you have to and Peter Pan welcomes the audience to tell Tinkerbell that they like fairies, that they believe in fairies, so they have to clap their hands. And that's sort of an audience thing. I'm not sure if that was written for the book or not, but it was written for the play, I believe. And that was the reason why it was kept in for a comedic, for like a thing to do in the show. I don't know if it was meant to be for the book or for the movie. But it's sort of a thing where that's where the believe in fairies comes in, though. So, in a way, this is a tool for people to get into the show a little bit. So I think that's the only way this scene is actually in the story. But anyway, it's either a trap or Tinkerbell just goes and tells Peter Pan tells Peter Pan to free the Lost Boys and Wendy when they got captured, the Darling Children. So Peter Pan goes and he comes across Tic Tac Croc before he could get to Captain Hook. So he does many mix of different things to get him his attention and to get him away from Captain Hook and his crew and the children. So he kind of distracts him for a little while and gets away. When he gets there, he frees the Lost Boys and the children, and it falls into a hectic battle with the pirates. It gets a little hectic and it gets a little brutal, but they succeed, having Peter Pan become the captain, like in the ending, and having all the Lost Boys and the Darling Children be a part of the crew as well, sailing off to the ship, going to bring the Darling Children back home. But Peter Pan is on the whole idea of bringing them home. He expected that the parents would have bars all over their windows, having for them to not come back to their house ever again, thinking that the Darling Children will stay with him forever. But then he realizes that they don't have bars. And he sees how the parents feel so bad about their children, like they miss them. So Peter Pan calls it all off and just lets them go home. And the ending kind of ends in a weird way you would never expect. But here's the ending. The ending ends with the story ends with the Lost Boys actually getting adopted by the Darling parents, the Darlings, and actually raising them until adulthood. Having Peter Pan to just live alone in Neverland with Tinker Bell. But here's the catch. Wendy gets to visit Peter Pan every spring. But as she does, she starts to notice that Peter Pan, slowly forgets everything. Like in the beginning, if you remember correctly, I told you that Peter Pan has short-term memory loss and doesn't remember much stuff. So every time that Wendy keeps returning, Peter Pan keeps forgetting Wendy, and eventually he forgets everything about Tinker Bell and Neverland eventually. Unfortunately, Peter Pan forgets everything, which is kind of sad and never really grows up. So he kind of is mature and just kind of roams around Neverland forever. It's kind of sad when you think about it. But anyway, it turns to be a bittersweet ending, with Wendy continuing this tradition with her daughter, having her to go to Neverland to entertain with Peter as well, and her daughter over. At least Peter Pan's not alone in that Wendy or one of her daughters gets to meet Peter Pan, gets to hang out with him every once in a while. So it's not like he's truly alone, just that he just will never grow up, and that's the end of it. And that is the ending to the Peter Pan story. Kind of a lot, right? Kind of to rethink about your childhood about Peter Pan a little bit, doesn't it? Tell me in the comments below what you thought about the story. And we'll see you next time. Bye!